Okay, hoping that the audio is sufficient. Might be a bit of a drag today. Let's see how we go situating us. It is the 17th of June, 2025, and currently in the city of Amsterdam. I don't know, I feel like times and places are significant and worth sharing. So there you go. I sort of deliberated about this for some time before hitting record. I don't feel very well and experiencing a lot of resistance to record anything. But I feel that it's important for me to at least try to learn how to articulate myself. I just much prefer dialoguing with people, you know? So I've been immersed in a extended period of change in the last few weeks to months. And that's it's been a yeah, a stage of personal maturation that has felt very connected to broader events in the world. And so I've been, yeah, experiencing some shifts in my point of view. And one aspect or one component of that process has been deepening my study of Carl Jung. And I can't explain why that has felt important. Certainly, I've been reading and thinking around Jung and his work for years. I would say originally, 2018 and 19, Peterson and Peterson's material points directly to Jung. And I first read Modern Man in Search of a Soul around that time. The motivational force, which is which runs as a thread through all of their work, comes from the same source, it seems. And that process has deepened in the last year of study of travel, but then also deeply studying and building a relationship with particularly part four of this individual dream symbolism in relation to the mandala, I think is the title. Part four of the book Dreams, which is extracted from Psychology and Alchemy, and uh, pulling together I'm explicating a series on that, but I'm finding that to be insufficient context because I'm also in the process of not just understanding his work, but who exactly he was and what he was up to and where he was coming from. And so there's been some reading and some thinking around him and his work, but also going back to the origins. Um, and I guess this is under an umbrella of feeling that we sort of live in a post-truth world, and that in some way it doesn't matter anymore what propositions, what explicit words people use, although of course it does. What's more important is, yeah, what they're attuned to, and yeah, the place that they're speaking from. And so I guess I'm assuming, for the sake of proceeding, that the that talking about Jung and trying to understand him and his work has relevance, has bearing on the current situation, and is can be helpful in decoding it. And one of the qualities that I'm trying to express or evoke here is that, when he spoke about this, um, I didn't even find the point and read it to you because it's a good one. I was just reading Man and His Symbols, Jung's chapter in this last thing that he wrote before he died. And he's sort of distinguishing how he approaches dreams from the way that Freud did. Let me just find the right section. Mm. So with Freud, we're talking about free association. So Freud uses the content of dreams to get the patient to talk about whatever they want, to the point of revealing their unconscious complexes. And Jung sort of realized that it wasn't necessary to use a dream as the point of departure for a free association. Um, you could basically reach the center from any point. So Jung says that you could begin with acrylic letters from meditations upon a crystal ball, from a prayer wheel, or a modern painting, or even from casual conversation about some trivial event. And any of these processes could be used in a manner of free association, and that dreams therefore have to do with something else. The connection here is that we can come to talk about what's most important, regardless of whether we start by talking about Jung or talking about anything else. And so this is just at the moment where my particular fascination happens to begin. Um, and since I get to decide, apparently, when I moved into the apartment little room that I'm in right now, I found several books here, including Man and His Symbols, and including the Red Book. And I have sort of been afraid of the Red Book for several years, and of going more deeply into Nietzsche as well, I might add. And felt that I wasn't ready for them. And I can't help but take that as a sign that I felt like I was more ready. Um, it feels like the right time. And so, as a result of looking at dreams, I came to understand that I was also analyzing Jung himself. And as a result of reading the introduction to the Red Book, um, which is written by a Jungian scholar named Shonu, what's his name? Sono Shamdasani. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce it, but as a result of reading the introduction, I came to understand that Jung was very different than I thought he was, and that approaching the origins, the genesis of his later work could be quite revealing and interesting. So, with all that as more or less preamble preface, I'm going to be putting together. Yeah, we're going to be looking at the Red Book, or at least I'm not sure we're going to be looking at all of it. I'm at the moment looking at the introduction, which is not written by Jung, but is a way of summarizing him and his life. And the document that I've written going along with this is taking sections that are relevant. It's about 9,500 words. And I think I'm going to stop. Okay, well, it is a little bit later, and I've since realized that I'm going to be increasingly exhausted if I continue taking in material at the rate that I am, if I cannot articulate myself at the same time. So I don't really want to, but I'm going to do it anyway just to relieve myself of the burden of whatever it is that I'm carrying or attempt to do that. Um, Part of the connection here is that the notion is that Jung's formative and early experiences have a bearing on the advent of the sacred, the birth of a new, let's say, religious sensibility, which is occurring in our time. Um, yeah, which speaks to their relevance. Anyway, I'm wanting to get into this. Um, if you know anything about Jung as a person, he's like highly intelligent, highly creative, highly open-minded, highly visual, um, prone to like waking dreams, visions, and really lent into that, like really made the most of that capacity. Um, he was born in 1875. He's Swiss. Um, he was the oldest child. He had one younger sister. Um, there's a section which describes his childhood years, and it's not that important for our purposes. He simply had several different, very strong dreams and images, which made a lasting impression upon him and structured his views towards Christianity most relevantly. Um, he became disillusioned with the church as a result of his um, experiences. and which involved direct communion with God, I'm going to say. And he recognized that the communion of the church, which his father sort of endorsed, um, could not offer something comparable, and so he became disenchanted. He His voracious reading sort of started around that time. We're taking here, if it's not clear already from the introduction by Sono Samdashani. We already talked about that. Um, he was particularly struck by Goethe's Faust, blah, blah, blah. And when he was at school, he felt like a strong difference between two alternating personalities within himself. Um, it's important because it shows up in all of his later work. So um, his sense of duality took the form of two alternating personalities, which he dubbed number one and number two. Number one was the schoolboy from Basel who read novels in Basel, and number two pursued religious reflections in solitude, in a state of communion with nature and the cosmos. This is a quote. That personality felt more real, but it um, didn't have a definable character like the number one personality did, and it was more connected to history, particularly with the Middle Ages. Whereas the number one personality was more public facing, more of a schoolboy, more sort of had more obvious failings and ineptitudes, more of a normal personality, let's say, more involved in the present. Um, Skipping forward a bit. Yeah, so he was sort of going to school in the latest part of what would be the 19th century. And then, yeah, it eventually gets toward, um, medical training as a psychiatrist and writing a dissertation. And what happens next? He basically, before anything interesting really happened, he was already established as a sort of rising star in the field of psychiatry. And that So he was already someone who had shown his aptitude for work and study in a way that was noticeable to other professionals. Um, by the year 1908, though, he'd already grown disenchanted by the limits of experimental and statistical psychology and turned towards therapeutics and his own growing clinical practice. Um, he had a So sort of already turning towards people. In 1906, he entered communication with Freud. They had a collaboration between 1906 and roughly 1909. But it's important to note that he'd already read Goethe, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, Kant. There were many people who, along with his predecessors in the field of psychiatry, um, people like Janet, um, Bueller was his main Bleu, Bleuler was his main sort of educator before he ran into Freud. Uh, Thus spake Zarathustra, particularly, and Faust. Both made great impressions upon him. Anything happening next? Yeah, in 1908, that same year, this is really still before anything interesting happened. He bought land and built a house on Lake Zurich in Switzerland, and he sort of began his study of mythology, folklore, and religion at around that time. And those interests in that period of study stemmed directly out of his interest in Nietzsche and Schopenhauer and Goethe, and the inadequacy of Christian communion in honoring the individual's direct experience of God, and also the inadequacy of Christian community in acknowledging the direct experience of his internal experience of having two different personalities, which can we can talk about as the spirit of the times and the spirit of the depths, essentially. Um, so that's already quite important. He's already married by this point. He married a lady named Emma, who was quite wealthy and well known, and that essentially allowed him to purchase land and then be in private practice for the rest of his life. He stayed and lived at that house on the shore of Lake Zurich for the rest of his life. This is in 1908, and we're going chronologically through roughly the next 15 years of what happened to Jung during that time. Um, and so he's already a voracious reader. He's already experiencing a profound um, disconnection between the profundity and reality of his inner experience and the culturally available means of holding that and giving it legitimacy and reality. And that led him into himself. It led him into his own living place, his own field of interest, and his own work. Um, he was assembling a vast library at that time already. Mythology, folklore, and religion were his focuses. And his researches of that time culminated in a book, Transformations and Symbols of the Libido, which is an earlier one of his works. And he essentially synthesized the 19th century theories of memory, heredity, and the unconscious, employing new anthropology. And he posited at that point the collective unconscious comprised of mythological images, which later became the archetypes. Um, yeah, so that's sort of like the fields of sort of comparative religion and ethnopsychology were sort of emerging for the first time and represented an important relativization of the Christian worldview. So this is sort of Jung's first attempt to use his different streams of interest, including anthropology, scientific interests, um, sort of comparative anatomy, to understand the genesis of his experiences and to start giving them a basis in reality that's not captured in Christianity. Transformations and Symbols of the Libido is an extended study of fantasy thinking and the continued presence of mythological themes in the dreams and fantasies of contemporary individuals. So this is a way to try and understand the dreams and visions and fascinations that he'd already had at that point. This is still in 1908. Yeah, at that time, he claimed, yeah, at that time, like for Jung, myths were symbols of the libido and they of like psychic energy, and they depicted the movements of inner psychic energy. Um, he he claimed that there were typical myths, um, and I mean, this later gets towards theory of archetypes, which were already like known and defined before Jung sort of really more popularized them, I would say. And one particular myth was given a central role to Jung, that of the hero mythology. For Jung, this represented the life of the individual attempting to become independent and to free himself from the mother. And so he interpreted the incest motif as an attempt to return to the mother to be reborn. Um, he was he would later regard that work as marking the discovery of the collective unconscious, although the term itself came from a later date. That's all still 1908. Yeah, and he at that point um, had already split with Freud. This is a bit later by 1911. And I'm noticing that Transformations and Symbols of the Libido was published in 1911, but it was the fruit of the work that took place in around 1908. And it was a critical time when for Jung, it marked the beginning of the second half of his life, actually. And he was sort of, as a result of splitting with Freud, who was really intent on sexualizing everything, Jung realized that he started to realize what it meant to live without a myth. Quote, like one without a myth is like one uprooted, having no true link either with the past or with the ancestral life with which continues within him, or yet with contemporary human society. And so this meant that he was driven to ask himself, what is the myth that he's living? Um, And so he sort of took it upon himself to get to know his own myth and regarded that as the his sort of his main task was to try to understand himself by legitimizing and contextualizing his existing, pre-existing strange experiences in the context of history, mythology, folklore that could help him to understand what was happening to him. And so the study of myth had revealed to Jung his own mythlessness. Um, and he then started to undertake self-experimentation work. Like he then started to look more directly at himself, trying to understand what was the myth that he was living. Because he realized, I mean, again, this is coming out of reading Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. These are like the originators of like nihilism and postmodernism and existentialism. There's sort of emptiness internally, which is implied at this cultural moment. Um, Whereas Nietzsche took to create new values, Jung's instinct was to return into the past, which sort of went along with a developing allegiance to what he called the spirit of the depths, or his number two personality, which he already had the experience of within himself. This gets us forward to the year 1912 when he had some significant dreams that he didn't understand. Um, Two of them, which I'm not going to review here. He found them oppressive and bewildering, and we're not really able to understand them. Um, One of the consequences of the second dream, which he regarded as particularly significant, that was shortly after Christmas 1912, um, he decided to pursue his relationship with Tony Wolff, who was a psychoanalyst in her own right. He's someone who Jung had a close emotional relationship with, despite also being married. And so, yeah, in he later remarked that this dream was the beginning of a conviction that the unconscious um, did not consist only in inert material, but there was something living down there. So he sort of came to the conclusion that, um, like this is like the idea of the unconscious is already formulated for a long time, even before Jung, and the idea here is that dreams, if interpreted in a way which is not so sort of oppressively Freudian, um, are actually trying to communicate something living, something that is autonomous and alive and speaking to us through the psyche, speaking to us through dreams. Jung came to this conclusion. Um, yeah, he was then driven to analyze his childhood memories because he realized that he needed to recover the emotional tone of childhood. Um, So he was trying to get to the bottom of the activity of his unconscious. He knew of no technique to do that. So he was trying to um, investigate his own fantasies in the hope that they would reveal something about what he felt was something living in the unconscious. So he felt that there was a living conscious force that was communicating from the unconscious to the conscious personality through the language of dreams and fantasies. And to get to the bottom of that and to understand better what was happening to him, he wanted to analyze his childhood memories, but realized that analyzing memories didn't really help. He needed to recover the quote emotional tone of childhood, so as to. It's not exactly clear why getting to childhood would help. I guess for Jung, it's deeply biographical in the sense that these experiences had been happening to him for the longest time, and if he could discover the origins of that in his own biography, by returning to the moment of those experiences, then of course that would be revealing. Just checking this is still going on, and we will keep going. yeah, so because he was not able to recover the emotional tone of childhood, he realized that he needed to do that more practically. So he recalled that he used to like building houses and other structures, and so he took to do that again. So he started using his hands. He started being practical and constructing things in the hope that this would um, allow him to get to the bottom of his own psyche. And so he started a process of self-analysis, and um, he'd already formulated the psychological types, the main ones of extroversion and introversion, and started speaking about that at the same time. So he's sort of maintaining a career at the same time as beginning a deep self-investigation process. Um, this is in 1913. Um, so he regarded the two main psychologies that were available at that time were from Freud and Alfred Adler, and so he took those as examples of the different psychologies are often true to the personality type of the people who originate them. And he thought that what was needed was a psychology that did justice to both of those types. Um, And just briefly on that, because I have been reading psychological types as well, the main difference between introversion and extroversion, as Jung thought of it, was in terms of the movement of the libido or psychic energy. So where is the psychic energy going toward? And in extroversion, the subject's interest is toward the outer world, toward objects in the outer world, whereas for the introvert, the subject's interest is directed inward to into the inner world. And so this is a this is a way of conceptualizing extrovert and introvert in terms of where energy is directed. Um, and this is why Freudian psychology, by revealing the dark underbelly, is sort of effective for extroverts. So when extroverts who are always directed outward discover that it's like, oh, there's something about our inner life which it can be revealing to us. And this is why Freudian psychology can be, according to Jung, sort of particularly effective for extroverted types. Whereas Adlerian psychology is more about the development and maintenance of personal power. So for introverts who have been um, directed far too much inward, it can be sort of effective in an equivalent way than Freudian psychology is. It can be revealing that if you simply like take some introverted people and help them to be more self-determined and more agentic, more autonomous in the world. This is a way that the development and maintenance of personal power can contribute to personal development in psychotherapeutic terms, but it's very much not Freud. It's sort of the opposite, at least from Jung's point of view. Anyway, that was a bit about introversion and extroversion. And so from 1912 onward, um, and going into 1913, this is just before the outbreak of World War One. So he's experiencing a series of dreams and visions that of and fantasies, dreams, and visions of catastrophe in Europe. For example, he um, in 1913, quote, the following month on a train to Schaffhausen, Jung experienced a waking vision of Europe being devastated by a catastrophic flood, which was repeated 2 weeks later on the same journey. And so at that point, when he started experiencing these dreams and visions, was afraid of he was afraid that he was going mad. So he was afraid that, and yeah, he thought that he was quite menaced with a psychosis. Um, there are several visions, like about 12 or 13, that are listed on one of the following pages. Um, between that, the ones I quoted were from there were dreams significant from 1912, but then there's a list later on um, of different fantasies, dreams, and visions which Jung may have regarded as precognitive, meaning telling the future. And they span the period between October 1913 and July 1914. And so we're still in the period before the outbreak of the First World War in 1912 and 13, and Jung's experiencing a series of dreams and visions which are catastrophic, um, involve catastrophic imagery of apocalypse of Europe being devastated by a catastrophic flood, for example. Um, in the in the years preceding the outbreak of war, apocalyptic imagery was widespread in European art and literature. Um, do I want to say anything about that? Um, yeah, so he realized at that point. I'm just checking where I am. Yeah, so he realized that transformations and symbols of the libido, which is the work that he'd already written, could be taken as himself. And he realized that an analysis of that text sort of inevitably led into analysis of his own unconscious processes. So he had a realization that his self-analytical process could significantly deepen. And he was at that point in time, like self-experimentation was very commonly used in medicine and psychology, and introspection had been one of the main tools in psychological research. A good book that demonstrates that is Henri Ellenberger, um, Ellenberger, maybe how you pronounce that. The Origins and History of the Unconscious, which talks about, the 300 previous years of history in psychology. Yeah, so he, as a result of realizing that, took to go directly toward fantasy. So up to that point, Jung had been an active thinker and been averse to fantasy. Um, as a form of thinking, I held it to be altogether impure, a sort of incestuous intercourse, thoroughly immoral from an intellectual viewpoint. But he now turned to analyze his fantasies, carefully noting everything, and had to overcome considerable resistance in doing this. Permitting fantasy in myself had the same effect as would be produced on a man if he came into his workshop and found all the tools flying around about doing things independently of his will. And so, in studying his fantasies, Jung realized that he was studying the myth creating function of the mind. So, at this point, he's like had a series of um, dreams, images, and visions, waking and sleeping, with catastrophic and apocalyptic imagery, and is seeking to understand them by deepening his process of self-analysis. He realizes that he needs to recover the emotional tone of childhood and get back to the genesis of these kinds of things, like start to understand how did this begin, where is this coming from, what's going on here. And he believes that um, deliberately inducing fantasy thinking and then analyzing the results is a means to do this. Um, as a result of these realizations, this is again still pre-World War. He's still afraid of psychosis. He's afraid that he's going mad. He's trying to work that out. He previously had a series of black notebooks, which he had been writing in as a sort of um, yeah, for example, a place that his second personality, the spirit of the depths, could write from. So his personal writing had been important to the expression of his, let's say, second personality. Um, he hadn't really had the time and space for that since being married, um, and had set aside that notebook that I mentioned in 1902. But he, at this point in time, which is in sort of 1913 and 14, took up that notebook again and started writing in it again. And so this is an important return to the his self-belief in the legitimacy of his second personality and the strange experiences that he was experiencing as expressions of that second personality. Yeah, it occurred to him that he could write down his reflections in a sequence. So that he was writing autobiographical material, but not as an autobiography. So basically, this led to um, dialogical dialogical expression, like expressions in the form of dialogue, which has been a prominent genre in Western philosophy since, you know, Socrates and Plato from the Platonic dialogues. Um, yeah, and so
this is this arrives at the self-analytical writings that structure the first part of the Black Books. Um, and the Black Books are quite literally the series of black notebooks that Jung wrote his early inner dialogues in, that will become more obvious why they're important later on. He was previously averse to fantasy, but had taken it up again. He So the dialogical format of his self-analysis. So this is like a deliberate inducement of fantasy. This is before the invention of active imagination. He doesn't know about active imagination yet. He hasn't formalized that, but he has formalized this writing process, and he's using dialogue as a key part of that. And that grew to the point of effectively writing letters to his own soul. So he was hearing inner voices and dialoguing with them. Um, in another time and context, I could point to a history of and resources about like inner dialogue, and it's like quite common and been used by people for a long time. Anyway, I'm not going to do that here. I'm going to say, um, yeah, while he was writing this second Black Book, he said to himself, "What is this I'm doing? It certainly is not science. What is it?" Then a voice said to me, "That is art." This made the strangest sort of impression upon me because it was not in any sense my impression that what I was writing was art. Then I came to this. Perhaps my unconscious is forming a personality that is not mine, but which is insisting on coming through to expression. I don't know why exactly, but I knew to a certainty that the voice that had said my writing was art had come from a woman. Well, I said very emphatically to this voice that what I was doing was not art, and I felt a great resistance grow up within me. No voice came through, however, and I kept on writing. This time I caught her and said, "No, it is not." And I felt as though an argument would ensue. He thought that this voice was the soul in the primitive sense, which he called the anima. So he wrote that in putting down all this material, this dialogical material for analysis, he was in effect writing letters to his own anima, to his own soul, and that he felt was a part of himself with a different viewpoint from his own more conscious viewpoint, let's say, own more egoic viewpoint. And so let me just check where I'm getting that from. This is Yeah, so he by engaging this character that he was imagining in a dialogue, he felt that he was engaging with a different viewpoint from his own viewpoint, and he was getting the remarks, the words of that new character, and so he was effectively in an analytical process with a ghost and with a woman, the same figure. Um, a good analogy here from popular culture is in the second Harry Potter film slash book. There it's I mean this is maybe where this is from, but Tom Riddle's diary forms an important part of that film, and Harry is engaged in um, an ongoing dialogue with the magical voice of Tom Riddle throughout the film. That pops up in Harry Potter again, as I recall, in the sixth film, Half-Blood Prince and book. He um, uses the secret book. The Half-Blood, this book is property of the Half-Blood Prince, which turns out to be Snape's potion book, as a way to, it's like a um, source of secrecy and personal relationship with a magic book. This must be a common theme. Certainly, it was for Jung. Yeah, and so Jung is now dialoguing with this imagined, but to him felt to be quite real character or personality, which is giving voice to his unconscious, which importantly here. In retrospect, he recalled that this was the voice of a Dutch patient who he knew from 1912 to 1918. Um, the woman had thought that the unconscious was art, but Jung had maintained that it was nature. And Samdashani has argued that woman, the only woman around Jung at that time, was a lady named Maria Malzer. And so this is important because this relationship with Maria Malzer is going to be significant later on. She was someone who um, came up with the idea of the anima with the soul, and wrote extensively on intuition, um, and the intuitive function that Jung basically failed to give proper credit to, and their relationship broke down. But what's important here is that Um, Jung's relationship with this woman, Maria Molzer, we think it's Maria Molzer, we're not sure about that, um, was extremely important in the genesis of Jung's relationship with the anima. And so when, as he's sort of starting to engage the unconscious more directly, it sort of uh, comes together in the form of a personality. Um, it forms into a personality for the sake of active dialogue, and um, the qualities of this Dutch patient seem critical to that process. So, quite, I got remarks of a new character. I was in analysis with a ghost and a woman. In retrospect, he recalled that this was the voice of a Dutch patient. So there's something about this. We think it's Maria Malta. There's something about this woman who um, their relationship in some way allowed for the the genesis, the origin, the concretization into a concrete personality of Jung's soul, Jung's anima. Um, yeah, that is quite significant. Yeah, and so the November 13 entries in the second Black Book depict Jung's sense of return to his soul. So he thought that more introspection was needed. So his process was still deepening. So he's establishing this relationship and then pursuing it with his own soul. Um, yeah. Quote, not knowing what would come next, I thought perhaps more introspection was needed. I devised such a boring method by fantasizing that I was digging a hole and by accepting this fantasy as perfectly real. The first such experiment took place on December 12th, 1913. And so he, at this time, basically um, comes up with active imagination. He's now deliberately, voluntarily, intentionally inducing fantasies, dreams, and images, um, dreams and visions, rather than having them happen to him. He's now trying to instigate them to investigate further what the heck's going on. Um, yeah, his method of active imagination, which I'm not going to describe here, is derived from his experience studying mediums, which is like people in trance states, which is again um, quite common around that time and like a big part of the sort of cultural milieu and psychological milieu in that Jung has been educated in. Um, it's pretty easy to find out about that if people are interested. Now, that period, November 1913, marks the beginning of his most difficult experiment. That's a quote. And during that period, the figure of Philemon, 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 who represents to Jung superior insight, first appears. And so important about that period. Mm, mm. Yeah, there was an important professor who had embarked on self-experimentations that Jung had taken from, connected with automatic writing, um, whose name was Staudenmayer, and he'd embarked on a period of self-experimentations in 1901, commencing with automatic writing. A series of characters appeared, and he found that he no longer needed to write to conduct dialogues with them. He also induced acoustic and visual hallucinations. The aim of his enterprise was to use self-experimentation to provide a scientific explanation of magic. He argued that the key to understanding magic lay in the concepts of hallucinations and the quote underconsciousness, and gave particular importance to the role of personifications. From examples like this, we can see that Jung's procedure closely resembled a number of historical and contemporary practices with which he was already familiar. And so from sort of December 1913 onwards, he was carrying on in the same sort of procedure. He would deliberately evoke a fantasy in a waking state and then enter into it as into a kind of dream or drama. And so these fantasies may be understood as a type of dramatized thinking in pictorial form. And in reading those fantasies, the impact of Jung's mythological studies is quite clear. So he's essentially taking the material from his mythological studies and then dreaming it, fantasizing about it. Um, yeah, the scientific question was to see what took place when he switched off consciousness, which we would now refer to as the default mode network. Yeah, it's a process of like frequent exercises in emptying the consciousness, the conscious. Yeah, and so yeah, Philemon first appears, who proves to be an important figure in subsequent fantasies. Um, I'm going to read his first appearance. Jung recounted, quote, there was a blue sky like the sea, covered not by clouds, but by flat brown clods of earth. It looked as if the clods were breaking apart, and the blue water of the sea were becoming visible between them. But the water was the blue sky. Suddenly there appeared from the right a winged being sailing across the sky. I saw that it was an old man with the horns of a bull. He held a bunch of four keys, one of which he clutched, as if he were about to open a lock. He had the wings of the kingfisher with its characteristic colors. Since I did not understand this dream image, I painted it in order to impress it upon my memory. When he was painting this image, he found a dead kingfisher, very rare in the vicinity of Zurich, in his garden by the lakeshore. Um, he later recalls that Philemon was a pagan and brought with him an Egypto-Hellenic atmosphere with a Gnostic coloration. It was he who taught me psychic objectivity, the reality of the psyche. Through the conversations with Philemon, the distinction was clarified between myself and the object of my thought. Psychologically, Philemon represented superior insight. So Philemon's going to be important in Jung's later visions, which is why it's important to mention his first emergence in this active imagination process. Um, Small edit. Okay, so at this point, yeah, so there's like a series of dreams, visions, images, fantasies that occur to Jung, both voluntarily and involuntarily, through active imagination and otherwise. This is during the period of 1912, 13, and 14. Um, Skipping over a bunch of more or less irrelevant things, during this period of 1913 and 14, he maintained a growing family, a private practice, and this process of self-experimentation all at the same time. He was seeing between 5 and 9 clients 5 days per week. Um, yeah, he also continued active military service duties every year. Um, Jung recalled that during this period, his family and profession always remained a joyful reality and a guarantee that I was normal and really existed. Um, so he's like got a serious amount of like self-experimentation, weird stuff going on in his own mind, and is yeah very much trying to deal with that at the same time as maintaining a normal life. Um, when the war broke out in 1914, Jung then understood his precognitive visions um, had come. He understood that. Wait, let me back up for a second. What I'm going to say is that he understood his precognitive visions had come from the collective unconscious and referred to Europe as a whole. But how do we get to the idea of the collective unconscious? I think it would be true for me to say the idea of the collective unconscious had already been formulated. Um, yeah, so he'd already been studying and writing about the structure of the unconscious long before the time of the outbreak of the First World War. And he had already um, theorized about how the structure of the unconscious was layered, um, although not in a strong way. So, for example, the contents of what one could call the personal unconscious, one's more personal material, was sort of closer to the surface, in a sense more subjective. They have to do with neuroses or material that come from one's own biographical lifespan. But the deeper layers of the unconscious have a more collective dimension, which Jung thinks about as more objective and less subjective, meaning less personal and more about having more to do with the archetypes. So like um, having more to do with material that could be common to everyone rather than unique to one person. Um, and he already has this understanding and then like realizes that his dreams and visions of apocalypse when they sort of came true in the sense of the outbreak of the First World War, he realized that he was not as much at risk of psychosis because these apocalyptic dreams and visions didn't refer to himself, but referred to the whole of Europe, let's say. So they were sort of, he understood them as coming through him from, quote, the subsoil of of the collective unconscious, but not being about him. And this was a relief to him at that time. He understood that, um, yeah, he wasn't in danger of schizophrenia, which was probably a relief. Um, Yeah, and so that also constituted a discovery, the discovery that these dreams, visions, and fantasies could be precognitive in the sense of um, predicting, in a sense, future events. And so he, when he understood this, this was sort of a key realization for him. After this, it was a precognition of a collective event, what he would later call a big dream, and he understood that what had happened in his fantasy had depicted not what would happen to him, but what would happen to all of Europe. And so after that realization, he attempted to see whether and to what extent that was true of the other fantasies he had already experienced, and to understand the meaning of this correspondence between private fantasies and public events. So there's a kind of correspondence that he was already feeling between what was going on in his inner world and what was happening in the real outside world. And there's a way that we think of the inner world as very personal and subjective, but Jung considered that these seemingly personal and subjective experiences corresponded with the very objective and um, impersonal collective events that were unfolding in real time. And his attempt to understand that correspondence between this series of personal and private fantasies and visions, the correspondence between those and the real world, that attempt to understand this kind of correspondence makes up much of the material of the Red Book. Because what this is ultimately going to be, this series of videos here is trying to understand what is the Red Book. Uh, so that's an important point. Again, to say that like there's Jung has discovered a correspondence between what's going on in his inner visions and what is happening in the outside world. He realized this in the most obvious way, in the sense that his visions of apocalyptic flood did not refer to himself, but referred to all of Europe. And this is a sort of very obvious correspondence, and he was now exploring to what extent less obvious correspondences also applied. Um, so he took the war as actually a sign that his fear of going mad had been misplaced. And again, as I said earlier, there are about 12 separate pre-existing dreams and fantasies that he'd recorded that he might have regarded as precognitive, which I won't recount to you here. He then, at that point, commenced writing the first draft of the Red Book. Um, the Black Books had already been written to this point, so um, the Black Books are the records of his dreams, visions, and fantasies, which so um, he in the Red Book he faithfully transcribed most of the fantasies from the Black Books, and then to each of these he added a section uh, explaining the significance of each episode, each vision, combined with lyrical elaboration. And what we're going to discover later is that there's like several different, like a more several different types of language that are focused on each of these experiences. But we're not going to go into that right now. Um, we're talking about the genesis of the Red Book here, and um, it stems from Jung trying to understand the collective significance of um, dreams and images that he's already had. Um, and so in this is around after the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, he starts to closely study Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra, which he'd already read in his youth. Um, it strongly influenced the structure and style of the Red Book. He also at this time read Dante's Commedia, which also helps with structure, but also informs the structure. Yeah, and so the what's important about Philemon from earlier is that the role of Philemon in Jung's work has analogies to the role of Zarathustra in Nietzsche's work and to the role of Virgil in Dante's work. And so in terms of the structure of the Red Book, which is what we're trying to end up talking about here, in the draft version, about 50% of the material is drawn straight from the Black Books, which are the record of his visions and fantasies. But then there are about 35 new sections of commentary. And there he attempted to derive general psychological principles from the fantasies and to understand the extent to which the events portrayed in those fantasies presented this in symbolic form, the events that were to occur in the world, which is more or less what I've just already said. And so to facilitate that, in 1913, he'd introduced a distinction between interpretation of visions and dreams on the objective level and on the subjective level. And I previously talked about objective and subjective as connected with the collective and personal layers of the unconscious, where Jung regards the more collective archetypal layers of the unconscious as more objective in a sense and less personal, more impersonal. And by contrast, the surface layers of the unconscious um, are more personal and, in a sense, more subjective. Um, But here, this other distinction that Jung has introduced since 1913 has a different use of objective and subjective. And so here the distinction is where on the objective level of interpretation, objects in dreams are treated as representations of real objects. Whereas on a subjective level of interpretation, elements in dreams are considered to only concern the dreams themselves. So what does that mean? Yeah, it matters in the sense that when we're trying to understand a dream, we can understand the contents of that dream to refer to qualities that are about the dreamer or qualities that are about quote, the real world, the objective world. And both of those are fruitful lines of inquiry, and that's what Jung means by subjective and objective types of interpretation of dreams. So the clarifying structure here is that there are forms of objective and subjective which go within and without. So in terms of the structure of the unconscious, the more surface layers are more subjective, according to Jung, and the deeper layers are more objective, according to Jung. But also, we have the inner world itself, the whole inner world, is in a sense more subjective, and what we call the outer world is more objective. And that each of these distinctions, the inner world and the outer world, dreams can be interpreted in relation to each of them. So when dreams are interpreted subjectively, they're interpreted in terms of the inner world, the inner landscape of the dreamer. But when they're interpreted objectively, they're interpreted in reference to what we call the objective or the external, the quote unquote real world. Um, this is important because Jung was trying to understand the degree to which his dreams and visions do actually correspond to collective and, in a sense, more objective events, where what Jung is basically going to come to is that his dreams have a they come from the layer of the collective layer of the unconscious, and they refer to collective objective events. So um, he's having dreams that are of course, they're deeply personal, but in a sense, they're not so subjective. And at least according to Jung, and they don't exactly refer to events or happenings in his own personal life. They come from a collective layer of the psyche, and they refer to a collective layer of reality. Um, yeah, as well as interpreting his fantasies on the subjective level, one could characterize his procedure here as an attempt to interpret his fantasies on the collective level. He does not try to interpret his fantasies reductively, but sees them as depicting the functioning of general psychological principles in him, and as depicting literal or symbolic events that are going to happen. Importantly, like those layers of interpretation are not mutually exclusive, so you can interpret dreams in reference to subjective material and objective material at the same time. Anything else that we need to talk about here? Basically, what this arrives us at in terms of understanding the structure of the Red Book is that the Red Book is a layered text where there's like a series of visions that are laid out that come from the Black Books, which are then interpreted by Jung in the form of commentary. So he has a new method of interpretation. He has a new hermeneutic method, which I was just talking about. And he, for the first time, uses that method in the commentary in the Red Book to talk about and interpret the visions which he includes, which come from the Black Books. He then continually reworked this sort of layer of interpretation. It was something that he worked on for a very long time. Yeah. Um, the first section of the work was untitled, but was composed on parchment. He then commissioned this giant red book, which looks something like this one, bound in red leather, and he um, the work is organized like a medieval illuminated manuscript with calligraphic writing, headed by a table of abbreviations. And he titled the first book "The Way of What Is to Come," and placed beneath this some citations from the book of Isaiah and the Gospel according to John. It was thus presented as a prophetic work. Just checking if there's anything else I want to say from this period. I don't think so. I'm going to keep going. So, I'm on page 3 of 20. Anyway, um, so this is a period of extended self-experimentation and self-analysis by Jung between the years, roughly, we were talking about this really first started to occur in a big way from the years 1911 and 12, when he experienced these more significant dreams that have apocalyptic imagery. Those continue until pretty much the end of the First World War. So this is sort of um, extended hiatus from Jung's academic work when he didn't really do a lot of publishing, um, but was mostly engaged in this self-experimentation at the same time as holding a private practice and a family. And so this is a sort of critical period between 1911 and 1918, which really constitute the Red Book, which formed the genesis of all of Jung's later work. So this is why we're focusing on this period. Um, During the self-explorations that characterized this period, Jung experienced states of great turmoil. So he had great fear, and sometimes had to, quote, hold the table to keep himself together. And so he was frequently so wrought up that he had to eliminate his emotions through yoga practices. Quote, but since it was my purpose to learn what was going on within myself, I would do them only until I'd calmed myself down and could take up the work with the unconscious again. And so, I mean, this is clear that like what Jung's experiencing is like seriously destabilizing and really testing his ability to hold himself together, because what was coming through him was so strong in the form of dreams, visions, fantasies, and emotions. Um, I've already talked about an ongoing relationship with Tony Wolff as well as his wife. And these people were able to help him understand and talk about and articulate what he was going through. So he recalled that Tony Wolff had become drawn into the process in which he was involved and was experiencing a similar stream of images. Jung found that he could discuss his experiences with her, but she was disoriented and in the same mess. Likewise, his wife was unable to help him in this regard. Consequently, he notes that I was able to endure at all was a case of brute force. Yeah, so what we're getting at here is that as Jung later writes about, when one turns one's focus um to the inner world and starts to approach and dialogue and in the way that Jung is doing, one often unlocks a lot of energy. And this is exactly what Jung was experiencing. There's a lot that's moving through him, um, energetically speaking. So, what is coming through him in the form of dreams, visions, fantasies, writings, the content of the Red Book is so powerful that anyone that's nearby him is sort of caught up in that energetic stream, which has I would have to get too much into energetics to explain why that is the case, but it's simply, let's say, an empirical fact that it seems to be the case. Um, while he was doing that, yeah, Jung's self-experimentation heralded a change in his analytic work, where he started to sort of encourage his patients to embark on a similar process of self-experimentation, which means that it wasn't exactly a solitary endeavor. Jung's confrontation with the unconscious was a collective one, where he sort of took his patients along with him. Um, and so there was at that time like a huge amount of creative material that was flowing through Jung, um, that were the content of the Red Books, the Red Book, excuse me. And um, in 1915, Jung began to write again in the Black Books, with a further series of fantasies. And so there were already, so as I mentioned earlier, the Black Books were like an earlier series, like from before 1911, earlier series of dreams and visions, which he then transcribed into the Red Book to interpret. He's now taking up the Black Books again to contribute more fantasies, more visions. And at this point, he'd already completed the handwritten draft of the Red Book. And so at that time, at the beginning of 1916, Jung experienced a striking series of parapsychological events at his house. Um, what do I mean by that? Yeah, I'm going to read this bit out. So in 1923, he narrated the event to Carrie Baines, who was an important translator of Jung's work, someone close to him, and she recorded it um, as follows. So this is from the point of view of Carrie Baines about Jung. Um, One night, your boy began to rave in his sleep and throw himself about, saying he couldn't wake up. Finally, your wife had to call you to get him quiet. And this you could only do by cold cloths on him. Finally, he settled down and went on sleeping. Next morning, he woke up remembering nothing, but seemed utterly exhausted. So you told him not to go to school. He didn't ask why, but seemed to take it for granted. But quite unexpectedly, he asked for paper and colored pencils and set to work to make the following picture. A man was angling for fishes with hook and line in the middle of the picture. On the left was the devil saying something to the man, and your son wrote down what he said. It was that he had come for the fisherman because he was catching his fishes. But on the right was an angel who said, no, you can't take this man. He is taking only bad fishes and none of the good ones. Then, after your son had made that picture, he was quite content. The same night, two of your daughters thought that they had seen spooks in their room. The next day you wrote out the seven sermons to the dead, and you knew after that nothing more would disturb your family, and nothing did. Of course, I knew you were the fisherman in your son's picture, and you told me so, but the boy didn't know it. So this is a um, I already talked just before about how when Jung was experiencing this intense um, energies, emotions, fantasies, dreams, and visions that were coming through him from what he thought about as the collective layer of the unconscious, that the people close to him became involved in that and experienced um, visions and images of their own that were similarly disorienting. Um, what we're talking about here is a different version of a similar phenomena where in Jung's house, at a particular point in time, in near the beginning of 1916, Jung's family were experiencing something. So his children, his son and daughters were seeing ghosts and um, not able to go to sleep and needing to draw images, and that like something was going on in their house. Um, and he describes this in his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections. So he recounted what happened. So Jung says, around 5 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday, the front doorbell began ringing frantically. Everyone immediately looked to see who was there, but there was no one in sight. I was sitting near the doorbell and not heard it, but saw it moving. We all simply stared at one another. The atmosphere was thick, believe me. Then I knew something had to happen. The whole house was as if there was a crowd present, crammed full of spirits. They were packed deep right up to the door, and the air was so thick that it was scarcely possible to breathe. As for myself, I was all aquiver with the question, for God's sake, what in the world is this? Then they cried out in chorus, we have come back from Jerusalem, where we found not what we sought. That is the beginning of the septem sermons, the seven sermons to the dead. Then it began to flow out of me, and in the course of 3 evenings, the thing was written. As soon as I took up the pen, the whole ghastly assemblage evaporated. The room quieted and the atmosphere cleared. The haunting was over. So, what this describes is a parapsychological event that happened in Jung's house at the beginning of 1916. So he experienced a time when a crowd of ghosts, a crowd of spirits inhabited his house and were haunting he and his family. He felt the need to write, and when he began to write, their influence went away. They essentially left them alone. And what he wrote was a work called Seven Sermons to the Dead, which is included in the Black Books. Um, so this work, Seven Sermons to the Dead, is a kind of culmination of the fantasies of this particular period of Jung's life. Um, Importantly, um, in a previous of Jung's fantasies from January 17, 1914, the dead had already appeared. This crowd of dead ghosts or spirits, and they said that they were about to go to Jerusalem to pray at the holiest graves. And they said when they came back to haunt Jung's house, they said, "We have come back from Jerusalem, where we found not what we sought." Um, so evidently their trip had not been successful. So as Shamdasani says, and so what this basically implies is that there's a kind of it, it implies many things, but they were about to go to Jerusalem to pray at the holiest graves, but were not able to. And so why would they then come to Jung? Well, that's a good question. So Seven Sermons of the Dead come out of this haunting, and it's a kind of culmination of the fantasies of the period. And what is the Seven Sermons to the Dead? What is it? It forms a key part of the Red Book, and it is a psychological cosmology in a cosmology model of the universe, let's say, um, which is cast in the form of a Gnostic creation myth. Um, I don't have time to explain what Gnosticism is. I recommend if you don't know what Gnosticism is, go look it up. So it's essentially it's a replacement for Christianity, essentially something like that. Um, in it's like a new religion that's basically being born here. And in Jung's fantasies, quote, a new god had been born in his soul, the god who is the son of the frogs, Abraxas. Jung understood this symbolically. He saw this figure as representing the uniting of the Christian God with Satan, hence as depicting a transformation of the Western God image. I hope that is clear, that that makes sense. So, like, Jung's basically found that Christianity is insufficient, inadequate to his religious and spiritual needs. And apparently, the crowd of dead spirits also finds something similar. And a new psychological cosmology cast in the form of a Gnostic creation myth is the result of that involves the birth of a new god in through Jung's soul. A new god had been born in his soul, who represents a uniting of the Christian God with Satan, and hence is depicting a transformation in the Western God image. It wasn't until much later, 1952, that in Answer to Job, that Jung elaborated on that theme publicly. Um, Anything else I want to say about that part? Yeah, so it's all quite important to what the Red Book is. Um, Following this, I believe following, um, at roughly the same time, on January 16, 1916, Jung drew a mandala in the Black Books, which was a first sketch of the, quote, Systema Munditotius, which means that this first mandala is a pictorial cosmology of the seven sermons to the dead. Um, so where the seven sermons to the dead is a psychological cosmology cast in the form of a Gnostic creation myth. The first mandalas that he is drawing are a pictorial representation of this cosmology. Um, yeah, this is quote, this is the first mandala I constructed in the year 1916, wholly unconscious of what it meant. Yeah, at this time, he felt that he was still in a state of chaos, and that it only began to clear toward the end of the war, toward the end of 1918. And so um, in 1917, from the beginning of August to the end of September, he drew a series of 27 mandalas in pencil in his army notebook when he was on military service. Um, at first, he didn't understand these mandalas, but felt that they were very significant. And from August 20 of that year, 1917, he drew a mandala on most days. This gave him the feeling that he'd taken a photograph of each day, and he observed how these mandalas changed. So this is an important development because Jung is now not only writing and expressing in the form of dialogical fantasies, visions, active imaginations, but is now also drawing mandalas in particular, which represent in pictorial form the inner changes and um, coherent cosmologies apparently that are emerging through him. Um, this is sort of origin of his relationship with mandalas, which is going to become quite important later. So they're sort of pictorial symbols of what's going on inside him. I mentioned earlier Maria Malta, who wrote about intuition and formed a part of the genesis of Jung's the concretization of Jung's relationship with his anima or soul. And excuse me, he recalled later on, as he was sort of drawing these mandalas while on military service in 1917, he recalled that he received a letter from this Dutch woman that got on my nerves terribly. Um, in this letter, the woman argued that the fantasies stemming from the unconscious possessed artistic worth and should be considered as art. Um, and he found this troubling because it was not stupid. Um, and because modern painters were attempting to make art out of the unconscious. And so it awoke a doubt within him, within Jung, whether his fantasies were really spontaneous and natural. The following day, he drew a mandala, and um, apparently he then says, "Only now did I gradually come to understand what the mandala really is: formation, transformation, the eternal mind's eternal recreation." It's a quote from Mephistopheles. Jung says, and that is the self, the wholeness of the personality, which, when everything is well, is harmonious, but which can bear no self-deception. My mandala images were cryptograms on the state of myself, which were delivered to me each day. So what's described here is a letter which from Maria Molzer, who's already shown a capacity to be deeply involved in Jung's inner process. And this letter disturbed Jung's process. And it leads him to consider more deeply the meaning of the mandalas which he's drawing, and realizing that they not only depict in pictorial form the inner process and particularly the cosmology that is emerging through him, but that they also represent the self, which is the wholeness of the personality, the emerging center of the personality. Um, my mandala images were cryptograms on the state of myself, which were delivered to me each day. Yeah. He wrote in a subsequent letter from 1918, Jung wrote that Maria Molzer has again disturbed me with letters. Um, yeah, so she's really showing this capacity to influence his process in certain ways. He reproduced these mandalas, which he'd been drawing in the Red Book, and he noted that it was during this period that the living idea of the self first came to him. The self, I thought, was like the monad, which I am, and which is my world. The mandala represents this monad and corresponds to the microcosmic nature of the soul. I'm just going to define for a second because I don't like to leave it ambiguous. Define monad. A single unit. Yeah, not the number one. Um, an indivisible and hence ultimately simple entity, such as an atom or a person. So it's a single unit. Um, just checking this is still going. Yeah, we're good. So yeah, so the self is a sort of image. No, sorry, the mandala is an image of the self. The self is like the monad which I am, and which is my world. So if you imagine the whole totality of self and world, because we normally think like, hey, there's a Sam and then there's a whole world. And if we think of all of that together, that is the monad which Jung thinks is uh, the self. And he's saying that the mandala represents that monad and it corresponds to the microcosmic nature of the soul. That's a that's a tricky one. we're going to talk later on, probably in dreams, about this correspondence between microcosmic and macrocosmic. So Jung takes the idea of the self as from the Atman Brahman conception from Hinduism. So there's a sense that like the small self and the big self correspond, and in Hinduism that's known as Atman and Brahman. I might even it's like not a very good way of talking about that. So yeah, in Hindu philosophy, the Atman is understood as the individual self or soul, while Brahman is the ultimate reality, universal consciousness, and the source of all existence. Um, where the goal of spiritual practice is often to realize the unity or non-difference between the two. So the Atman is more like the eternal, unchanging essence within each living being. Um, so it's more has to do with the individual qualities, the qualities that are unique to a person, let's say. Whereas the Brahman is more like the absolute, the infinite, the eternal reality that underlies and permeates everything. And one of the doctrines from Hinduism, particularly in Vedanta, is that Atman and Brahman are ultimately one and the same. Um, Meaning that like the most individual self is sort of identical with the ultimate reality. Um, and Jung is saying that this correspondence between Atman and Brahman is sort of really key in defining what he means by the self, where you imagine the symbol of the mandala is like a circle with a dot in the middle. And we experience this phenomenologically in the sense that there's an I, Sam, an I, Sam, I'm in the middle. I'm sort of represented by the dot in the middle of the circle. And then there's this whole world, which is sort of around me. And it's like the small self, the me that's in the middle is like the microcosm, and the big world, the world that's around me is like the macrocosm. And in Hinduism, that's like Atman and Brahman. And um, both of them together are that constitute the self in Jung's terms. Yeah. At this point, he did not know where this process was leading, but he began to grasp that the mandala represented the goal of the process. So it's a process, it's not just a static uh, phenomena. Quote, only when I began to paint the mandalas did I see that all the paths I took, all the steps I made, all led back to the one point, that is, to the center. The mandala became the expression of all paths. The mandala became the expression of all paths. Yeah, so I'm just checking if there's anything else I want to say for this section. Yeah, so this means that the draft of the Red Book contains the fantasies from that came from October 1913 to February of 1914. He um we've also talked about this is about the structure of it. So it includes material. So there's like the black books are like a record of the fantasies and visions which occurred to him, including the seven sevens to the dead, which are then included in the Red Book and commented on and analyzed from different uh, points of view, from different voices. He also, beginning in the winter of 1917, wrote a fresh manuscript entitled Scrutinies, which sort of began where he'd left off previously. Um, and he, in that section, he sort of transcribed the fantasies that he had had between 1913 and 1916. And similarly as in the first two books of the Red Book, he interspersed those fantasies with interpretive commentaries. So the Seven Sermons to the Dead was included in that material, with as well Philemon's commentaries on each sermon. And so um, Jung was able to listen to the voice of an inner guide or within him to comment on the meaning of some of the visions that he'd had, including Seven Sermons to the Dead. And so in those commentaries, which are presented in the scrutinies section of the Red Book, Philemon stressed the compensatory nature of his teaching, meaning that he deliberately stressed precisely those conceptions which the dead lacked. Um, what this means is that the meanings that are contained in Seven Sermons to the Dead and the commentary which Philemon presents constitute together a kind of whole meaning. And this essentially means that the structure of the Red Book has three different parts, of which the scrutinies is the third part. But I'm not going to go into that anymore right here. Yeah, at this point in time, the fantasies in the Black Books became more intermittent. But he did portray his realization of the significance of the self, um, which took place in the autumn of 1917, and that was in Scrutinies and the third section of the Red Book. And that contains Jung's vision of the reborn God, which culminates in the portrayal of Abraxas, the uniting of the Christian God with Satan, which I mentioned earlier. He realized that much of what had been given to him earlier in the earlier part of the book, the Red Book, was actually given to him by Philemon. And so at that point, he realized that there was a prophetic, wise old man within him, to whom he was not identical. So realizing that he was not equivalent to this wise man within him is an important moment of disidentification with that person, with that figure. And that meant that his key task now was to sort of work over his different fantasies, and to try to understand them and to sort of differentiate the voices within them and the different characters. So that, for example, in the Black Books, there's Jung number one, representing the sort of spirit of the times, which I did mention earlier, um, and who speaks to the dead. But in the scrutiny section, it's Philemon who speaks with the dead. Um, so there are different voices that are going on. And so in the Black Books, which are included, the main figure with whom Jung has dialogues is his soul. But in some sections, this is changed to the serpent and to the bird. And in one conversation, his soul explained to him that when quote the above and below are not united, she falls into three parts: the serpent, the human soul, and the bird or heavenly soul. So if you want to understand the meaning of that, just to say that hexagram 12 from the I Ching presents that archetypal situation of above and below not being united. And Jung's soul communicates with him that she has three different parts. She has a tripartite nature, and that these correspond to sort of earth, earthly, like connected with the serpent, sort of everything lower, and or shadowy. The middle layer is sort of human soul, and quote the bird or heavenly soul, which visits the gods. And the reason I mention this here is because it's going to be significant later on in terms of dreams and in terms of the individuation, not just of the individual soul, but of the soul of all the world. So that's why I've mentioned that. Um, moving on a little bit, quote, it's very important that we experience the contents of the unconscious before we form any opinions about it. I very much agree that we have to grapple with the knowledge content of Gnosis and of Neoplatonism, since these are the systems that contain the materials which are suited to form the basis of a theory of the unconscious spirit. Um, so he was discussing his experiences with his colleagues and talking about the importance of understanding ancient knowledge systems, namely Gnosticism and Neoplatonism, because they contain the materials suited to form the basis of a theory of the unconscious spirit. Um, yeah, and what we can see from that point is that the content of the Red Book is it presents a series of active imaginations together with Jung's attempt to understand their significance. Um, and that means that it's a work of understanding which encompasses a number of different interlinked threads. I'm taking from the book here at the moment. It's an attempt to understand himself, to integrate and develop various components of his personality. It's an attempt to understand the structure of the human personality in general. It's an attempt to understand the relation of the individual to present-day society, and the relation of the individual to the community of the dead. It's an attempt to understand the psychological and historical effects of Christianity, an attempt to grasp the future religious development of the West. Jung also discusses many other themes in the work, including the nature of self-knowledge, the nature of the soul, the relations of thinking and feeling, and the psychological types, the relation of inner and outer masculinity and femininity, the uniting of the opposites. It discusses solitude, the value of scholarship and of learning, the status of science, the significance of symbols and how they're to be understood, the meaning of the war, of madness, of divine madness, and psychiatry, how the imitation of Christ is to be understood today, the death of God, the historical significance of Nietzsche, and the relations of magic and reason, if that's not quite enough. The overall theme of the book is how Jung regains his soul, and overcomes the contemporary malaise of spiritual alienation. This is ultimately achieved through enabling the rebirth of a new image of God in his soul and developing a new worldview in the form of a psychological and theological cosmology. The Red Book presents the prototype of Jung's conception of the individuation process, which he held to be the universal form of individual psychological development. Um, what we're going to start to understand here is that Jung's attempt to understand the fantasies and visions that are included in the Red Book basically took the rest of his life. It really forms the significant material of Jung's life that his later work is derived from. Um, he thought that um, and this is a lot of that is sort of this is quoting from again Sonu Shamdasani's introduction to the Red Book. Um, he thought that Jung thought that the significance of the fantasies was due to the fact that they stemmed from the mythopoetic imagination, um, which was missing in the present day rational age. And so he thought that they were coming from a mythopoetic place, and that was their significance. He thought that the task of individuation, or sort of individual psychological development, was in establishing a dialogue with the fantasy figures, with these contents of the collective unconscious, and to integrate them into consciousness. He thought that this would recover the value of mythopoetic imagination, which had been lost to the modern age. This he thought would reconcile the spirit of the times with the spirit of the depths. And so, if we recall, like um, those already formed different sub-personalities within him, Jung 1 and Jung 2, the one that was more modern and one that was distinctly ancient, religious, solitary, and somber or melancholy. He thought that this um, listening to the voice of his soul, he thought that this would reconcile these. He thought that mythopoetic imagination could do this, symbolic language. And so that task, the task of individuation, which was to sort of construct creative dialogue between these voices, he thought that this was the task of individuation, and that formed the leitmotif of his subsequent scholarly work. It's a very roundabout way of saying that what happened to him in terms of the content of the Red Book he then spent the rest of his life trying to integrate and understand. If I move on here, in 1916, Jung wrote several essays and a short book where he began translating some of the themes of the Red Book into more contemporary psychological language. So his attempt to understand what's happening to him begins quite early, while it's still going on. And in that work, he presents the first major outlines of his mature psychology. Um, and that book was, um, I'm not sure I can find it. I'll find it if I need it. I guess this the section that follows, that we're talking about here, which is the section entitled "A New Spring of Life" in the introduction to Jung's Red Book by Sonu Samdashani. Um, it contains, um, like we're overviewing the elements of Jung's work from that period, around 1916, which are most relevant to the Red Book. So the understanding of his work, which is already being generated while this is still going on, is most relevant to understanding the Red Book. He It's important that, in 1911 to 14, Jung had already been concerned with establishing a structural account of general human functioning and of psychopathology. And so, in addition to his earlier theory of the complexes, which had already been published, that was kind of what made him famous to start with. Um, we know that Jung by this time had already formulated conceptions of a phylogenetically acquired unconscious, peopled by mythic images. What that means is that like he'd already thought up the idea of the collective unconscious, and he already thinks that we sort of inherit this phylogenetically speaking, and that it is populated by mythic images or archetypes, which have a which take the form of like non-sexual psychic energy. So this is differentiating from Freud. Um, he'd already formulated as well the general types of introversion and extroversion. Um, he'd already thought about the compensatory and prospective function of dreams, meaning he already thought a lot about dreams and how they could compensate and predict the future. And he already came up with a synthetic and constructive approach to fantasies. This is sort of by the time period of 1911 and 1914. And so his the later developments that came around the time of 1916, which is what we're going to talk about here, sort of move beyond that point, by trying to use that basis to understand the content of the Red Book. Um, one of the new one of those new developments was to, um, attempt to provide a temporal account of higher development, and so which he termed the individuation process. And so, basically, like how does development work across the lifespan, over time? This was something new for him to try to understand. And I would say that that was a sort of, pivotal theoretical result of his self-experimentation process, and the full elaboration of that individuation process and its historical and cross-cultural comparison would come to occupy him for the rest of his life. This is from Samdashani. So we can see here how, the basis for Jung to approach his unconscious was already well established by his previous theories and his previous experiences. When the content of the Red Book came about, he then elaborated his previous theoretical material to attempt to understand it. Yeah, this is, just to say that in 1916 was the lecture entitled "The Structure of the Unconscious," in which, that's the point at which, he differentiates the more subjective personal layer of the unconscious from the more objective impersonal collective unconscious, which is inherited. Um, One of the main tasks here, Jung noted that when individuals um, separate themselves, split themselves off from the contents of the collective unconscious, and instead regard them as coming from themselves, more personal attributes, they tend to experience states of, quote, superiority and inferiority. Um, so when someone regards themselves like either extremely highly in an inflated godlike way or extremely lowly in a worthless kind of way, um, he thinks that this arises from the fusion of personal and collective psyche that he thinks is one of the dangers of analysis. So he regarded it as very important to um, separate oneself from the collective psyche in a sense of understanding, oh, this isn't coming, it's not about me, it's coming through me, but it's about everything. He felt that this was very important to avoid um, inflation or deflation. Um, yeah, he wrote that it was a difficult task to differentiate the personal and collective psyche because um, because when one analyzes the persona, it sort of dissolves into the collective psyche, and one realizes that one isn't anything, which sort of unlocks all of this mythological thinking and feeling. Um, the difference between like when you analyze the persona and it dissolves in that way, unlocking mythological thinking and feeling, the difference between that state and the state of insanity lies in the fact that doing that on purpose is sort of intentional, which is not much of a difference. Um, he thought that a couple of possibilities resulted from that that condition of he thought that like when you differentiate the collective unconscious from the personal unconscious, you can then sort of you can try to regressively restore the persona and return to the prior state, which would sort of stop the mythological thinking and feeling from happening. Um, the image I have is like blocking a dam, but Jung thought that it was impossible to get rid of the unconscious, so it wouldn't really work that way. Alternatively, one could accept the condition of godlikeness, which is basically accepting an inflated state and living in that way. And he thought that there was a third way that was possible, which involved the hermeneutic treatment of creative fantasies, which is what he chose as kind of like this uh, synthesis of the individual with the collective psyche, which revealed a kind of lifeline by like so by undergoing this creative synthesis of personal and collective psyche, the process of individuation could unfold. And what this means is that the self and the world could transform together. So rather than reducing the individual psyche to the collective psyche, or rather than reducing the collective to the individual psyche, they could both sort of evolve or develop in a mutualistic or symbiotic way. And that was the approach that Jung chose. I just wanted to, there's an important definition that comes at this point in time, which is in 1916. He defined he first introduces the notion of the anima here, the image of the soul. And he thinks of this as a counterpart to the persona. The persona is like the public-facing image, the mask, or the role that we play. But he defines the anima here as how the subject is seen by the collective unconscious. So if you imagine that in the collective unconscious, there's a point of view, there's something living and autonomous, which is looking at the subject, looking at the conscious world. Well, um, how the individual appears from the point of view of the collective unconscious is the anima, according to Jung. Um, yeah, so in October of 1916, Jung presented two different talks. What do I want to read here? Yeah, the first one was entitled Adaptation. And in that talk, he presented how adaptation to the inner conditions, the inner unconscious conditions, what that leads to is the demand for individuation. Um, so there's a way here where like when one has all of this internal material going on, one has to adapt to that in order to live well. That leads to a demand for individuation. But he thinks that that is contrary to adaptation to others. So he feels that responding to the demands of the inner world leads to a form of personal development that takes one away from contact with and being understandable by other people. So he thought that answering that this demand from the inner world leads to a break with conformity, leads to a break with conforming to the values of others. He thinks that this leads to a kind of guilt, and to get rid of that guilt, he thinks that a new quote collective function is called for because he thinks that the individual, in a kind of Nietzschean way, has to produce values that serve as a substitute for his absence from society. And so there's a creative synthesis that results from adapting to the inner world that has to sort of contribute something because of the individual's absence from society. He regards this contribution, this result of the creative synthesis with the inner world, as a way of making reparations to the collective because of the absence. Um, that's a bit on inner and outer adaptation as connected with the individuation process. Adaptation to the inner world is not the same as adaptation to the world of others. Um, what he sort of meant there that individuation was not for everyone, it was for people who had so much going on internally that they needed to get it to create something to work it out, essentially. I mentioned two different talks that Jung gave um, in October of 1916. The first one was called Adaptation. The second one is called On Individuation and Collectivity. Um, yeah, so here he argues that the process of individuation and collectivity are a pair of opposites that are related by guilt, which is quite interesting. And so he argues that society demands imitation. So if the society wants us to, society sort of inherently wants us to do what everyone else is doing. It demands imitation. Um, and by doing that, you can sort of gain access to your own values. Um, I don't exactly know why that is important. I'm going to leave that behind just to say that it's not important to understand imitation there. It's just about individuation and collectivity. So there's a way that they're played off against each other, where adaptation to others and to the social world is in contrast to the process of individuation, which is more adaptation to one's inner and internal dynamics, and that they're a pair of opposites that are related by guilt, where getting rid of that guilt involves the process of creative synthesis by which something meaningful can be contributed to society, that allows one not to feel guilty anymore. And for Jung, it was like there was a creative synthesis that resulted from trying to understand his creative fantasies and visions and active imaginations that resulted in his psychological theories, which he contributed to the world that led him to not feel guilty anymore. Um, when he was on military service in November, this is still in 1916, he wrote a paper. How did he write a paper when he was on military service? Anyway, he did that, and it was entitled "The Transcendent Function." Um, um, the transcendent function sort of later became the individuation process. It was sort of his first attempt to write about the individuation process, which is why it's important. Um, around that time, he described his technique for inducing spontaneous creative fantasies through active imagination. I'm not going to review that here. Um, and the main reason for that is because there are many techniques for doing that. Breathwork and psychedelics is an obvious one to name. Um, Not that I would recommend that necessarily. Um, Jung said that once the fantasies have been produced and embodied, then two approaches are possible. The creative formulation is one, and understanding is another. Um, he thinks that those processes need each other. So as a result of so once these fantasies are sort of produced, once they appear, then we can create as a result of them, and we can try and understand as a result of them. And there's a kind of hermeneutic cycle which he's describing, where like we have these visions and fantasies that we experience them, then creating is a kind of revelation, the creation that follows, and then the attempt to understand the creations and visions. And then creations that follow from that, and more understanding, and more creation, and more understanding. And this cycle is Jung's response to the fantasies that he um, experienced. He thinks that this hermeneutic cycle, creative formulation as a result of the fantasies and understanding as a result of the fantasies, he thinks that they both need each other and that both of these stages are necessary to produce the transcendent function or the individuation process, and which he thinks arises out of the union of conscious and unconscious contents. So where the visions and fantasies are products of the unconscious, the creative productions and understanding that can follow from that, from those revelations, um, are an attempt by the conscious side of the personality to unify with the unconscious side of the personality. And this, it's a kind of braid which is forming between the conscious and unconscious, that comprises visions, fantasies, active imaginations, uh, creative production like drawing mandalas, and of understanding, um, intellectual and otherwise. And it's out of this process that the transcendent function or the individuation process arises. Um, yeah, Jung noted that it was for some people it was simple enough to note that there was another voice in writing and to answer it from the standpoint of oneself. And so where to sort of engage in dialogue with oneself, where this dialogue led to the creation of a transcendent function. Um, so for some people this is enough, this dialoguing with oneself. Um, he thinks that this results in a widening of consciousness. Yeah, and so this depiction of inner dialogues and the means of evoking creative fantasies in the waking state, this represents Jung's own undertaking in the Black Book. So this is what Jung was doing in the Black Books. Whereas the interplay of creative formulation and understanding, this hermeneutic cycle that I talked about, this corresponds to Jung's work in the Red Book. Anything I want to talk about there? Yeah, so this was work from 1916. In 1917, he published a short book, The Psychology of the Unconscious Processes. This was then taken up into um, one of the essays in two essays on analytical psychology, but it was first published in the book, The Psychology of Unconscious Processes. And in the preface to that book, he proclaimed, this is a quote, he proclaimed that psychological processes that accompanied the war had brought the problem of the chaotic unconscious to the forefront of attention. Yeah, so just a little segue here to say that as a result of understanding this, I sort of there have been I've been um writing somewhat poetically and prophetically for some time, and that sort of came to a head. There was a an outpouring of this in May of 2025, which is sort of like last month. And reading Jung's Red Book was really an attempt to understand how to approach that and how to understand it in connection with events in the world going on now. June of 2025. Um, and what else do I want to say about that? Yeah, I feel that yeah, I feel that we in some way have to finish the work that Jung started. There's a way that I'm going to talk about later that Jung wasn't really able to stand behind his um, the messages of his soul. He wasn't able to back them up in a certain way, and um, it would sort of take me too far afield to talk about that now. But what I want to say is that this is deeply connected with my own internal process, and I feel that um, as Jung said, like Jung says here, the psychological processes that accompanied the war had brought the problem of the chaotic unconscious to the forefront of attention. Um, what I'm essentially interpreting here is that like there's a kind of correspondence, as we already talked about, between what's going on in the inner world and what's going on in the outer world, personally and collectively. So I'm interpreting the same thing from my own experience. Like I'm um, suggesting, I guess, arguing, although I don't want to be arguing with anyone, that um, what I've been experiencing and writing can be profitably understood from the same point of view, if you like, from a similar point of view. Um, Jung says that the psychology of the individual corresponds to the psychology of the nation, and that only the transformation of the attitude of the individual could bring about cultural renewal. So we're looking at here like how can we change internally so as to come to terms with uh, and respond to, like, account for the events that are unfolding in the world at this current time. And specifically, what I mean is enlightenment or bust from Daniel, in the sense that, like, I believe that there is a sort of mycelial network of interconnected consciousness that is knitting itself together within the collective unconscious of humanity in real time. I think this is happening now. I think that the meta crisis is sort of coming to a head in the next months to years, weeks to months to years, and that um, something is preparing to respond to that from the level of the collective unconscious. And I think that our job is to sort of get out of the way of that, so as to allow it to happen. And I think the Red Book talks about that. I think that's what it's about, um, which I'll defend that ongoingly. But what's important here is that I feel that it's a feeling that I have that um, there are perturbations and disruptions uh, in the collective field, um, that are going on, and those manifest in the inner world just as much as they do in the outer world. And I think that those correspond. And um, I guess, then furthermore saying that sensitive and intuitive individuals can pick up on that, and talk and write about it. And I'm then claiming that I am one such sensitive and intuitive individual, and that my experiences are relevant. Well, I guess I'm hoping that they are, but yes, I'm stating that they are. Because, as Jung says, the psychology of the individual corresponds to the psychology of the nation. So how can, quote, only the transformation of the attitude of the individual could bring about cultural renewal? Like, how is it possible for the individual to change our attitude, our experience, to respond in some way to the unfolding meta crisis in real time. That's what we're exploring here. And basically, what Jung is saying is he's articulating a sort of intimate interconnection between individual and collective events, and that forms part of the heart of the Red Book. He'd already made that conjunction between his precognitive visions and the outbreak of the First World War since pre 1914 or 1914. Um, and he'd already made apparent these deep subliminal connections between these individual fantasies and world events. Um, what was now required of him was to work out this interconnection in more detail. Um, yeah, and so Jung argued that um, one needed to separate oneself from the unconscious by presenting it visibly as something that was separate from person. Um, and I'm not sure about this. I may disagree with him here because he may. There's points at which Jung, I'm going to argue, sort of steps off the path and does not follow through in the way that he needs to. Although I'm not sure about that. So we're sort of we've been believing Jung and following him along, sort of down the garden path, as it were, to an extent, or at least learning about what happened to him. But then there are going to be points or moments in time of feeling like he got it wrong. And this might be one of them, I'm not sure yet. Um, Jung argued that one needed to separate oneself from the unconscious by presenting it visibly as something that was separate from one. He said that it was absolutely vital to differentiate the I from the not I, from the collective psyche or the absolute unconscious. And um, to an extent, I agree with him. Um, but there are also traps the other way. Like, I guess the thing here is that, like, if we don't, if they're conflated, the contents of the collective unconscious and one individual self, if they're conflated, then inflation is the result. Um, but if they're not linked, if they're not connected, um, which they are, then one isn't able to live up to who one really is. And this is equally a risk. But Jung was far more sensitive to the first of those risks, which is the risk of inflation. So he's emphasizing the need to differentiate between the content of the collective unconscious and one's individual or personal life. It's kind of equivalent to Atman and Brahman in some way, where the spiritual goal is, in some sense, to um, dissolve the boundary between them. But it's funny, like I want to use a little analogy here from Lord of the Rings. So there's a moment in The Return of the King. I mean, if you haven't seen Lord of the Rings, then you should. So in Lord of the Rings, in The Return of the King, um, Aragorn takes the paths of the dead through the mountains to try to recruit an undead army to help defeat the orcs of Mordor. And when he does that, he um, enters a cave, a passage through the mountains, and encounters an undead army who tell him that the way is shut and that it was made by those who are dead and the dead keep it. And basically, he and his compatriots are trapped and they can't get out. And at this moment in time, um, when they recognize that they're trapped and that they can't get out, um, Aragorn is sort of able to access the depths of his inner strength and trust in himself, and sort of show his inner strength such that he can reveal himself as um, the heir of Gondor and as the king, and using like by relying on that inner strength, he could essentially defeat the king of the undead soldiers and command their loyalty. The important point there is that um, the connection that I'm drawing there is the connection that I'm drawing there is in a situation of desperation, being trapped. Aragorn was able to move most fully into being himself. He was able to be fully himself. He was able to inhabit his own personal identity um, uh, in an extreme way. Um, when so this is like moving fully into Atman, one might say. Um, fully being fully into himself, stepping fully into his power, if you like, his power of being self-determined. He sort of it was a moment of sort of like I am Aragorn to like the utmost, if you like. And it was at that moment when his sword, literally like the reforged sword of Numenor, was able to block the ghostly blade of the sword of the King of the Dead, which should be impossible. Like that. So there's a kind of miracle, if you like, the kind of magical or impossible feat which happened as a result of stepping into the source of his own power. Um, the connection there would be that by going fully into oneself, one finds that one finds a deep interconnection with the transcendent or the divine. So, like when we move fully into what's personal, we discover what is transcendent or divine. Um, there are other examples of that throughout. Another quick example is Harry Potter at the end of Prisoner of Azkaban. I know I talk about this one a lot, but it's a good analogy, right? It's like the end of Prisoner of Azkaban, he is waiting for his father to show up and cast the Patronus to save himself and Sirius from the Dementors. And when Hermione tells him, Harry, there's no one coming, you're dying, Harry's like, oh, it's me. And then he steps into the empty space that was left by the absence of his father and is able to um, cast the Patronus fully for the first time, saving himself in the past and Sirius too. It's a kind of an example of like stepping into himself, being the most self-determined, being the most Harry Potter that he can be, is the same moment when uh, a moment of divinity or transcendence or magic um, can occur. And so what this reveals is but this sort of highlights an error that Jung is making, I think. I'm not sure about it though, and I want to hold on to that um, question mark. So Jung is saying that it's important, it's critically important to differentiate the personal from the collective, and um, so he's sort of highlighting the difference or highlighting the separateness so as to avoid inflation. I'm sort of, in a way, I'm stating the opposite. I'm saying that by emphasizing one's individuality, by being most oneself, by being most self-determined, most autonomous, most individual, it's in that moment when one is given most access to what we could call collective or transcendent or miraculous. In the sense of like if Atman is Brahman, which is the whole point of Vedanta, then doesn't Jung miss that by emphasizing the difference? So Jung claims that it's vital to differentiate the I from the not I, namely the collective psyche or the absolute unconscious. He says, to do this, man must necessarily stand upon firm feet in his I function. That is, he must fulfill his duty toward life completely, so that he may, in every respect, be a vitally living member of society. So, yeah, Jung is sort of saying here, he's sort of clinging to his identity. And so he said, I am Jung the psychologist. I am a family man. I am a dutiful member of society. I am vital and living and contributing in this way. And he feels that this I am quality is a sort of he's able to root himself in this. He's able to stand within that individuality. And in so doing, he feels that he is able to uh, differentiate himself from the material, from the contents of the collective unconscious, and preserve himself from psychic inflation. And I guess I'm arguing that he might be wrong. Like it's tricky because I don't want to say that he's fully wrong. I think he might be. I think he might be not living up to his own destiny in a certain way. I think he may um, have allowed the contents of the collective unconscious to pass through him without fully understanding or embodying them, and was so terrified by what came through him that he sort of clung to his egoic identity as a way of coping with that. Not to say that that's a wrong thing to do, but I'd like to say that it's by standing more firmly within one's I function, within one's self-determined quality of like contributing to being a living member of society. This should give one strength to more deeply access uh, the collective unconscious and its flow, rather than take one away from it. But I'm not sure that's true of Jung. Now, just double checking if there's anything that I want to contribute here. Yeah, so this was we've been talking about the quality of differentiating oneself from the collective unconscious that Jung felt was quite important, and that he wrote about in the book, 1917 book, The Psychology of the Unconscious Processes. And this in this book, he sort of articulates the intimate interconnection between individual and collective events, but describes how they should be distinguished and separated as well. And we were talking about a potential mistake that Jung made in his own process in doing that. And more evidence for that is going to be forthcoming. So, in addition to that short book from 1917, which was called The Psychology of the Unconscious Processes, which I said was taken up into two essays on analytical psychology in later work. Um, in addition to that, um, in that same work, The Psychology of the Unconscious Processes, he also developed his conception of psychological types. Um, that work on psychological types and on the transcendent function was then later taken up in his book, Psychological Types, which I happen to be reading at the moment and will be talking about, which is partly why this content on the psychological types is relevant and interesting. Um, I'm just checking this is still recording. It does seem to be. We've been going a while, but that's okay. That's good. Yeah, so to mention this just briefly about psychological types. So if we imagine just like a normal person and their development, Jung notes that it's common that the psychological characteristics of the types are pushed to extremes. And so in terms of introversion and extroversion are the main types that they talk about. So if the energy is going outward towards objects, this is extroverted way of being. Introverted is like the energy is going inward toward our inner world, let's say. And Jung feels that there's a law of reversal into the opposite when things get pushed to the extreme. The word for which is enantiodromia, which comes from Heraclitus, who's a Greek philosopher. And so this law, like when things get pushed to the extreme, they turn into their opposite. And this means that um, there are secondary functions, which are like namely he talks about these as like for the introvert, this is feeling, and for the extrovert, this is thinking. So these are secondary functions for Jung, and he thinks that they're found in the unconscious, and he thinks that the development of these contrary functions also leads to individuation. And so it would take me too far afield to address psychological types here. So I'm going to say that um, we're talking more about the process of individuation here. We're talking about how this synthesis between um, individual and collective material and between conscious and unconscious material, how this results in the process of individuation. Jung is saying that how we relate to the psychological functions within us is relevant to that. Um, yeah, so basically it's these um, developing these undeveloped functions, the ones that we don't rely on as much, is key to engaging with the unconscious, because it's out of that that what he calls the transcendent function arises. Um, so it gives uh, results in a sort of rebalancing process, um, which gives access to the productive and beneficent aspects of the unconscious. Um, I think that's all fine. So we might leave it there for the moment. Yeah, I'm going to pause this. So, well done for keeping up with this. We're going to keep going soon.